Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, stretching your arms, rubbing your eyes, and looking out your window. But there is no sunrise. There has never been a sunrise. Not for you, not for your parents, not for your grandparents. Instead of a sky, you see a curved metal ceiling 200 meters above your head, glowing with artificial light that someone programmed decades before you were born. Instead of a neighborhood, you see the same corridors, the same walls, the same recycled air you have breathed every single day of your existence. You know every face on this ship, all 800 of them. You have known them since you were born. You will know them until you die. And the worst part, the part that keeps you awake in what passes for nighttime on this vessel, is a single devastating truth. You did not choose this. You never chose this. Your great-grandparents did. They signed up for the greatest adventure in human history, and in doing so, they sentence you to a life inside a metal tube, hurtling through the most empty, most silent, most crushingly vast void imaginable. Now, here is a number that should stop you cold. The Voyager 1 spacecraft, launched in 1977, is the fastest human-made object to ever leave our solar system. It travels at roughly 17 kilometers per second. That sounds fast, and it is fast, until you realize that at that speed, reaching the nearest star system, Proxima Centauri, just 4.24 light-years away, would take approximately 73,000 years. Let me say that again, 73,000 years. That is longer than the entirety of recorded human civilization. That is longer than the time since humans first painted on cave walls. And Proxima Centauri is our nearest neighbor, the cosmic equivalent of the house next door. So what if we built something faster? What if we pushed the boundaries of nuclear propulsion, fusion drives, antimatter engines, and achieved 1 to 2% of the speed of light? That is far beyond anything we can build today. But physicists say it is theoretically within reach. At that speed, the trip to Proxima Centauri would still take 200 to 400 years. Generations, multiple human lifetimes. People would be born on this ship, grow old on this ship, and die on this ship, never having touched a planet, never having felt wind, never having seen a horizon that was not a curved wall. And their children would do the same. And their grandchildren. And their great-grandchildren. This is the concept of a generation ship, and it is simultaneously the most ambitious and the most terrifying idea in all of space exploration. But here is what keeps me up at night, and I think by the end of this, it will keep you up too. The engineering challenges of a generation ship are immense. The propulsion, the shielding, the life support, the structural integrity over centuries. Engineers have been working on these problems for decades, but the part almost nobody talks about, the part that might make the entire concept fundamentally impossible, is not the metal or the fuel or the physics. It is the human brain. It is what happens to the human mind when there is literally nowhere to go. It is what happens to a society when it is sealed inside a container for a quarter of a millennium with no escape, no rescue, and no end in sight for the people living through the middle of the journey. What happens to a human mind when there is literally nowhere to go? Can a society survive 250 years in a metal can without tearing itself apart? Would your great-grandchildren even want to complete the mission you started? And what if the biggest threat to an interstellar voyage is not the vacuum of space, not the cosmic radiation, not the failing life support systems, but the 3-pound organ sitting between your ears? Today we are going to break down the most terrifying, most fascinating, and most scientifically disturbing problem in all of space exploration. We are going to examine what happens to human psychology, human society, and the human body across generations in deep space. We are going to use real science, real experiments, real data from NASA, from the European Space Agency, from Russian isolation studies, from Antarctic research stations, from submarine crews, from every analog we have for what life on a generation ship might look like. And I promise you, the answers are far stranger, far darker, and far more fascinating than any science fiction movie has ever shown you. Let us start with the basics, because before we can understand why a generation ship might drive your descendants insane, we need to understand what a generation ship actually is, and why anyone would ever consider building one. The concept is older than you might think. In 1929, the physicist and polymath J.D. Bernal published a book called The World, the Flesh and the Devil, in which he imagined massive spherical space habitats carrying populations of 20 to 30,000 people through interstellar space. In 1940, a pulp science fiction writer named Don Wilcox published what may have been the very first generation ship story called The Voyage That Lasted 600 Years in a magazine called Amazing Stories. The idea was simple and horrifying in equal measure. If you cannot travel fast enough to reach the stars in one human lifetime, you send a ship designed so that generations of people are born, live, and die during the voyage. The descendants of the original crew would be the ones to finally step onto a new world. The reason we need generation ships comes down to one of the most fundamental laws of physics. Nothing with mass can travel at or above the speed of light. This is not a technological limitation that we might overcome someday. This is woven into the fabric of reality itself, described by Einstein's special relativity. The speed of light is approximately 300,000 kilometers per second, and as any object with mass approaches that speed, the energy required to accelerate it further approaches infinity. You simply cannot do it. And without faster-than-light travel, without the warp drives and hyperspace jumps of science fiction, crossing the distances between stars requires timescales that dwarf a human lifetime. Now, this is not just theoretical daydreaming. Right now, in our actual real world, there is an organization called the Initiative for Interstellar Studies, or I4IS, which has launched something called Project Hyperion. This is a real design competition, where real teams of engineers, architects, and social scientists are designing actual generation ships. The competition has specific constraints. The mission duration is 250 years. The destination is a rocky planet that will have been prepared for colonization by earlier robotic probes. The habitat section must provide 1 g of artificial gravity through rotation. The atmosphere must be similar to Earth's. The ship must protect against galactic cosmic rays and impacts, and the crew will number approximately 1,000 people, give or take 500. These are real scientists working on real designs, and the fact that they felt the need to include a social scientist on every team tells you something profound about where the real challenges lie. To give you a sense of scale, imagine the ship itself. We are not talking about something the size of the International Space Station, which is roughly the size of a football field and supports a crew of 6 to 7. We are talking about a structure potentially kilometers long. One popular concept is the O'Neill cylinder, proposed by physicist Gerard O'Neill in the 1970s, which envisions a pair of counter-rotating cylinders several kilometers in length and a couple of kilometers in diameter. The interior surface of each cylinder would be landscaped to resemble Earth, with artificial lighting simulating a day-night cycle. Rotation would create centrifugal force that mimics gravity. It sounds beautiful, and in many artistic renderings it looks beautiful. Green hills, rivers, small towns under an artificial sky, but the beauty hides a terrifying fragility. Here is the thing about a generation ship that separates it from every other engineering challenge humanity has ever faced. If something goes wrong, there is no rescue. On the International Space Station, a critically ill astronaut can be evacuated to Earth within hours. On a lunar base, resupply is days away. Even on a Mars colony, communication with Earth takes only minutes, and resupply missions are possible within months. But a generation ship traveling at 1 to 2% of light speed is so far from Earth that a radio signal would take years or decades to reach home, and any physical rescue is utterly impossible. If the life support fails, if the food supply collapses, if a disease sweeps through the population, if the social order breaks down, there is no help coming. The people on that ship either solve the problem themselves or they die. All of them, every man, woman, and child. And this has to remain true for 250 consecutive years without a single catastrophic failure. The British Interplanetary Society recently worked on a detailed design for a post-O'Neill space colony called Avalon, designed to support 10,000 people. They got deep into the engineering. They designed the rotating habitat, the agricultural sections, the atmospheric processing systems, and after years of detailed work, they concluded that even their optimized design still required regular inputs from Earth. It could not achieve full self-sufficiency. As researcher Hempsell noted, the ability of a space colony to operate without support is likely comparable to transport infrastructure journey times of 3 to 4 months. A generation ship needs to operate without support for 250 years. That is 3 orders of magnitude beyond what even the most sophisticated space colony designs can achieve. The gap between what we can design and what a generation ship requires is not a step. It is a chasm. And now we arrive at the part of this story that most people overlook. Because while engineers debate propulsion systems and life support recycling rates, there is a quieter, darker problem lurking beneath all the hardware. The human mind. The human heart. The human soul, if you want to be poetic about it. Because you can build the most perfect ship in the universe, with flawless radiation shielding and perfectly recycled air and optimally designed artificial gravity. And it will not matter one bit if the people inside go mad. Let us talk about what isolation does to the human brain, and let us start with an experiment that actually happened. In 2010, 6 men walked into a sealed facility at the Institute of Biomedical Problems in Moscow, Russia. 3 Russians, 1 Chinese, 1 French, 1 Italian-Colombian. They sealed the door behind them, and they did not come out for 520 days. This was the Mars-500 experiment, the longest high-fidelity spaceflight simulation ever conducted, designed to mimic the duration of a round-trip mission to Mars. 520 days. About 1 year and 5 months. And the results were disturbing. Let me walk you through what happened to these 6 carefully selected, highly motivated, psychologically screened volunteers over those 17 months. First, their sleep fell apart. The crew's sleep-wake cycles degraded severely, with some members' sleep patterns shifting by several hours. One crew member became so sedentary that he barely moved for weeks at a time. The researchers described it as hypokinesis, a dramatic reduction in physical activity driven not by physical illness, but by psychological withdrawal. The crew's engagement with each other declined. Conversations became shorter, less frequent, more functional. The social bonds that had formed in the early weeks of the experiment eroded. But here is the finding that chilled me to the bone. As the months wore on, the researchers noticed something happening to how the crew processed emotions. They were shown images, some positive, some negative, and asked to rate them. Over time, the crew members began rating negative images as positive. They were looking at disturbing or sad images and calling them neutral or even pleasant. The researchers described this as emotional blunting, a defense mechanism where the brain, overwhelmed by the relentless monotony and confinement, simply dials down its emotional responsiveness. It is not that they became happy, it is that they became numb. The brain, faced with an environment it cannot escape and cannot change, simply stops reacting. And one crew member experienced depression throughout nearly the entire mission, reporting depressive symptoms in 93% of mission weeks. And remember, this was 520 days, not 520 years. These men knew they were in Moscow. They knew the door could be opened in an emergency. They knew their families were alive and well on the other side of that wall. They knew they would walk out and breathe fresh air and eat real food and see the sun. Strip away every single one of those psychological safety nets and imagine the Mars-500 results amplified across a lifetime, across 100 lifetimes. That is the psychological landscape of a generation ship. There is a phenomenon that researchers have documented across nearly every isolation environment on Earth, from Antarctic research stations to submarine patrols to space analog missions. They call it the third quarter phenomenon. The pattern goes like this. During the first quarter of any isolation mission, morale is high. There is excitement, novelty, the thrill of beginning. The second quarter brings adjustment. People settle in, routines form, the initial excitement fades but is replaced by a comfortable rhythm. Then the third quarter hits and everything falls apart. Depression spikes, aggression increases, irritability becomes constant, sleep deteriorates, cognitive function declines measurably, interpersonal conflicts intensify, and then in the fourth quarter there is partial recovery because the end is in sight. The human brain can endure almost anything if it knows the suffering will end. Now think about what this means for a generation ship. The first generation is in the first quarter. They are the pioneers, the adventurers, sustained by purpose and the memory of Earth. But the middle generations, generation 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, they are perpetually in the third quarter. They are in the worst psychological phase, and they are trapped there for their entire lives. There is no fourth quarter coming, not for them. The end of the journey is generations away. They will live and die in the third quarter, and their children will be born into it. Let me tell you about a place on Earth that comes as close as anything to simulating the generation ship experience, at least in miniature. It is called Concordia Station, and it sits on the Antarctic plateau at an elevation of 3,200 meters, one of the most remote places on our planet. During the Antarctic winter, from February to November, the sun does not rise. Not at all. For months, the crew of about 15 people lives in total darkness, in temperatures that can drop below -80 degrees Celsius, completely cut off from the outside world. No flights in or out, no evacuations possible. The nearest other human settlement is 600 kilometers away across impassable terrain. The European Space Agency uses Concordia specifically as an analogue for long-duration space missions. And what happens to the people there? They develop what researchers call the winter over syndrome. The symptoms read like a horror story written by a psychologist. Insomnia, depression, irritability that escalates to outright aggression, memory impairment, where people forget conversations they had that morning, difficulty concentrating on even simple tasks, increased alcohol consumption, and then there is the most haunting symptom of all, something called the Antarctic stare. People simply zone out. They sit motionless, staring at nothing, unresponsive, for minutes at a time. They are not sleeping. They are not thinking. They are just gone, somewhere inside themselves, their minds disconnecting from a reality they can no longer bear to process. ESA researchers at Concordia documented this with clinical precision. They wrote, and I am quoting directly, "Absence of mind and confusion are part of the winter over syndrome. These are healthy, intelligent, carefully selected professionals. People who wanted to be there, who trained for years to be there, who knew exactly how long their stay would last. And within months, the isolation and monotony and darkness began to disassemble them psychologically. Now imagine that, but for a lifetime. Now imagine being born into it. Let us talk about what monotony does to the physical structure of your brain. This is not metaphorical. This is not poetic. Your brain physically changes shape in response to monotonous environments. Research published in neuroscience journals has shown that sensory monotony alters the hippocampus, the brain region responsible for memory consolidation and spatial navigation. Synaptic density decreases. Neuronal function degrades. The brain, starved of varied sensory input, begins to atrophy in the very regions that make you you, your memories, your sense of where you are, your ability to form new experiences, and file them away for future reference. Think about the sensory world of a generation ship. There is no wind, there is no rain, there are no changing seasons, no thunderstorms rolling across the horizon, no birdsong at dawn, no crunching of leaves underfoot, no snow, no heat waves, no fog, no frost. The same corridors, the same rooms, the same lighting schedule, the same ambient hum of machinery, day after day, year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation. And the brain was not built for this. The human brain evolved on the African savanna, in an environment of constant sensory change, predators, weather patterns, seasonal shifts, new landscapes discovered during migration. The brain expects novelty. It needs novelty the same way the body needs food. Deny it long enough, and it begins to consume itself. Astronauts on the International Space Station, who spend only 6 months in orbit, report that even the absence of natural sounds creates a subtle but persistent psychological discomfort. They miss birds. They miss rain on a window. They miss the random ambient sounds of Earth that most of us never even consciously notice. One astronaut described the silence of space as not peaceful but oppressive, a silence that presses in on you. And these are people who can look out a window and see the entire planet Earth, a psychologically anchoring visual stimulus of extraordinary power. On a generation ship, the window shows nothing. Black void, pinpricks of starlight that do not change, that do not move perceptibly for years on end. An unchanging view of the most profound emptiness imaginable. Now layer on top of this the disruption of something so fundamental to human biology that most of us never even think about it. Your circadian rhythm, the internal clock that tells your body when to wake, when to sleep, when to release hormones, when to digest food, when to be alert, when to be drowsy. This clock was calibrated over millions of years of evolution to Earth's 24-hour day-night cycle, driven primarily by sunlight hitting specialized cells in your retinas. On a generation ship, there is no sunlight. Artificial lighting must simulate the day-night cycle, and research from the International Space Station shows this is extraordinarily difficult to get right. On the ISS, astronauts experience 16 sunrises and sunsets every 24 hours as the station orbits Earth every 90 minutes. Their circadian rhythms are thoroughly disrupted. 75% of ISS astronauts use sleep medication. Studies show they average less sleep than on Earth, with more frequent awakenings, reduced slow-wave sleep, and disrupted REM cycles. NASA has identified circadian misalignment as a significant contributor to cognitive performance deficits during spaceflight. And the ISS has windows with views of Earth, a powerful light-dark cue from the planet itself. A generation ship has none of this. Disrupted circadian rhythms do not just cause bad sleep. They trigger a physiological cascade that touches virtually every system in the body. Cortisol, the stress hormone, loses its normal daily rhythm and can remain elevated, increasing anxiety and suppressing the immune system. Melatonin production becomes erratic, affecting not just sleep but also mood regulation and possibly even cancer risk. Cognitive performance drops measurably, particularly in areas of attention, reaction time, and decision-making. There are links between chronic circadian disruption and increased risk of depression, metabolic disorders, cardiovascular disease, and even accelerated aging. And this is from disruption lasting months. On a generation ship, the disruption is permanent. People would be born into a world with imperfect circadian cues, grow up with them, and pass on the physiological consequences, possibly epigenetically, to their children. If you are still watching, and I hope you are, because we are about to go even deeper, hit that like button right now. This is the kind of content that takes weeks of research, and if it is teaching you something new about the universe and the human mind, a like helps more than you know. Subscribe if you want more deep dives like this, because we are just getting started. And I want you to drop a comment right now answering this question honestly. Would you volunteer for a generation ship, knowing that your grandchildren would spend their entire lives in space and never feel the sun on their face? I genuinely want to know your answer. Now, let us keep going. We have been talking about the mind, but the mind lives inside a body, and that body is under assault in deep space in ways that most people never consider. Let us start with the invisible killer, galactic cosmic rays. Right now, as you are listening to this, you are being bombarded by cosmic radiation. On Earth's surface, you absorb about 3 millisieverts of background radiation per year. You do not notice it. Your body's repair mechanisms handle it effortlessly. But Earth's atmosphere and magnetic field are doing enormous work on your behalf, deflecting and absorbing the vast majority of cosmic radiation before it reaches you. Step outside that protective bubble, and the situation changes dramatically. In deep space, far from any star's protective magnetic field, the primary radiation concern is galactic cosmic rays, or GCRs. These are not gentle rays of light. They are high-energy subatomic particles, protons, helium nuclei, and heavy ions like iron traveling at near-light speed, with enormous energy packed into each individual particle. When a heavy GCR particle hits biological tissue, it does not just pass through. It tears through cells like a microscopic cannonball, breaking DNA strands, destroying cellular machinery, and creating a shower of secondary particles that cause additional damage along their path. The estimated radiation dose for a crew traveling to Mars distance is approximately 672 millisieverts per year. That is more than 200 times Earth's background radiation. And here is what that radiation does to the brain. Research from the University of California, San Francisco, led by Professor Susanna Rosie, and from NASA's own Human Research Program, has shown that exposure to GCR-like radiation causes measurable, lasting damage to the brain's cognitive architecture. Dendritic complexity decreases. The elaborate branching structures that neurons use to communicate with each other become simpler, less interconnected. Spine density drops in the hippocampus and cortex, reducing the brain's capacity for learning and memory formation. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of decision-making, planning, and impulse control, shows altered cellular signaling. The amygdala, which processes fear and anxiety, is damaged in ways that increase anxiety behaviors. Laboratory studies in mice exposed to GCR-equivalent radiation show learning and memory impairment that persists for at least 6 months after exposure. NASA's own risk assessments estimate that on a long-duration deep space mission, 1 in 5 astronauts would experience significant behavioral changes, and 1 in 3 would face measurable memory processing difficulties. These estimates are based on relatively short missions, months to perhaps a couple of years. On a generation ship, the exposure is not for months, it is for an entire lifetime. And not just your lifetime, your children's lifetime, and their children's lifetime. This brings us to something particularly disturbing, the question of whether radiation damage can be inherited. The NASA twin study comparing astronaut Scott Kelly, who spent a year on the ISS, with his identical twin brother Mark, who remained on Earth, revealed that spaceflight causes significant epigenetic changes, alterations in how genes are expressed without changes to the underlying DNA sequence. While most of Scott Kelly's gene expression returned to normal within 6 months of returning to Earth, some changes persisted, and Scott Kelly was in low Earth orbit, partially protected by Earth's magnetic field, for just 1 year. On a generation ship in deep space with higher radiation exposure over entire lifetimes, epigenetic changes could accumulate and potentially be passed to offspring. Research published in Nature has shown that radiation-induced epigenetic alterations can affect chromosomal positioning and gene expression in ways that are heritable. What this means in plain language is that the radiation damage experienced by Generation 1 does not necessarily stay with Generation 1. It could be inherited by Generation 2, compounded by their own exposure, and passed on again. Each generation might start from a slightly worse cognitive baseline than the one before. Over 10 generations, the cumulative effect could be substantial. Now, you might be thinking, what about shielding? Can we not just build walls thick enough to stop cosmic rays? The answer is complicated in a way that borders on cruel. Yes, you can reduce GCR exposure with shielding. Water is one of the best materials, as are hydrogen-rich polymers and thick layers of regolith. But GCRs are so energetic that stopping them completely requires impractical amounts of mass. And here is the cruel part. When a high-energy GCR particle hits a dense shielding material like metal, it does not just stop. It shatters into a shower of secondary particles, neutrons, protons, pions, and other fragments, that scatter in all directions. These secondary particles can actually be more biologically damaging than the original cosmic ray. This is called secondary radiation, and it means that in some scenarios, adding shielding actually makes the radiation environment inside the ship worse. Magnetic shielding has been proposed, creating an artificial magnetosphere around the ship similar to Earth's natural one, but the engineering requirements are enormous. The superconducting magnets would need to generate fields of extraordinary strength and maintain them flawlessly for 250 years. A single failure in the magnetic shielding system could expose the entire population to dangerous radiation levels with no backup protection. The Project Hyperion competition lists radiation protection as one of its 7 primary design constraints, and the fact that it remains listed as a constraint rather than a solved problem tells you everything you need to know. Let us move from radiation to gravity, because the gravity situation on a generation ship presents its own unique set of challenges. The leading design concept is a rotating habitat, essentially a giant cylinder or ring that spins to create centrifugal force that mimics gravity on its inner surface. In principle, this works. The physics is straightforward. If you rotate a cylinder of a given radius at the right speed, objects on the inner surface experience a force that feels like gravity. But rotational gravity is not identical to real gravity, and the differences matter. The most significant difference is the Coriolis effect. In a rotating reference frame, objects in motion experience a force perpendicular to their direction of travel. On a practical level, this means that objects do not fall straight down on a generation ship. Drop a ball from shoulder height and it will curve slightly as it falls. Walk in the direction of the habitat's rotation and you will feel slightly heavier. Walk against the rotation and you will feel slightly lighter. Throw a ball to a friend and it will curve in unexpected ways. These effects are more pronounced in smaller habitats and at points closer to the axis of rotation, where the effective gravity is lower. For the human vestibular system, the sensory apparatus in your inner ear that governs balance, orientation, and spatial awareness, these Coriolis effects create constant low-level confusion. Your eyes tell you one thing. Your inner ear tells you another. Your proprioception, the sense of where your body parts are in space, gets a third signal that does not quite match the other two. On Earth, these systems are exquisitely calibrated after millions of years of evolution. On a rotating generation ship, they are in constant subtle conflict. Research suggests this can cause persistent motion sickness, disorientation, and spatial cognition difficulties, particularly during the adaptation phase. But on a generation ship, the adaptation phase is permanent. No human being has ever been conceived, gestated, born, and raised in artificial gravity. We have literally zero data on what happens to human development under these conditions. We know what happens in microgravity because astronauts have experienced it. Bones lose 1 to 1.5% of mineral density per month. Muscles atrophy, with up to 20% mass loss within weeks. The cardiovascular system deconditions, with the heart becoming rounder and less efficient. The brain itself shifts upward within the skull as cerebrospinal fluid redistributes in the absence of gravitational gradient, causing increased intracranial pressure, white matter changes, and even vision problems. Artificial gravity from rotation should prevent most of these effects, but should is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. The subtle differences between rotational gravity and real gravity, the Coriolis forces, the gravity gradient from floor to head in a curved habitat, the slightly different mechanical loading on bones and muscles, could all have effects we cannot predict because no one has ever experienced them long term. And here is an evolutionary point that is genuinely eerie to think about. 250 years is roughly 10 human generations. That is enough time for natural selection to begin operating. In the ship's unique gravitational environment, with its specific radiation profile, its particular atmospheric composition, bodies will begin to adapt, not through conscious choice, but through the slow, relentless pressure of differential survival and reproduction. People whose biology is slightly better suited to the ship's environment will tend to be healthier, will tend to have more surviving offspring. Over 10 generations, the humans who arrive at the destination might be physically different from the humans who left Earth. Different bone density, different muscle distribution, different vestibular calibration, different immune profiles. They might step onto a natural planet and find that their bodies, shaped by 10 generations of adaptation to the ship, are subtly wrong for the world they were sent to colonize. Now, let us talk about the life support system, because this is where the rubber meets the road in terms of raw survival. A human being requires approximately 2 metric tons of consumables per year. That includes food, water, and oxygen. For a crew of 1,000 people over 250 years, the total requirement is 500,000 metric tons. To put that number in context, 500,000 metric tons is roughly the cargo capacity of the largest container ships ever built. You would need to fit all of that onto a starship, along with the propulsion system, the habitat, the shielding, and everything else. Obviously, you cannot carry all those consumables. You must recycle. The ship must be a closed-loop system, taking waste and converting it back into usable resources, water, oxygen, food, indefinitely. This is called a closed ecological life support system, or CELS. And here is the uncomfortable truth. No one has ever built one that works. Not for a space station. Not on Earth. Not for even a small crew over even a short time period. The most famous attempt was Biosphere 2. And I want to tell you this story in detail because it is the single most important cautionary tale for anyone who thinks generation ships are a solvable engineering problem. In September 1991, 8 people, 4 men and 4 women, were sealed inside a massive glass and steel structure in Oracle, Arizona. Biosphere 2 was designed to be a completely self-sustaining ecosystem. It covered 3.14 acres and contained 5 biomes: a rainforest, an ocean with a coral reef, a mangrove wetland, a savanna grassland, and a fog desert. It had agricultural areas to grow food for the crew. It had sophisticated atmospheric monitoring and processing systems. It cost over $200 million to build. It was, at the time, the most ambitious closed ecosystem experiment ever attempted. Within months, things started going wrong. The oxygen level inside Biosphere 2 began dropping. Not slowly, alarmingly. It fell from the normal 20.9% to 14.5%, equivalent to the oxygen level at an altitude of about 4,000 meters, roughly the elevation of the summit of many major mountains. The crew experienced chronic fatigue, impaired cognition, and shortness of breath. The cause turned out to be microorganisms in the soil. Bacteria were consuming oxygen faster than the plants could produce it, and the excess carbon dioxide was being absorbed by the concrete structure of the building itself, locking it away where neither plants nor recycling systems could access it. They eventually had to pump in oxygen from outside, breaking the seal of the closed system. The food situation was equally dire. Despite having dedicated agricultural areas, the crew could not grow enough calories to feed themselves properly. They lost weight. They were constantly hungry. Their physical and cognitive performance suffered. Insect populations went haywire, with ants and cockroaches thriving while pollinators like bees declined, threatening the already struggling food production. But the failure that concerns us most today was the social one. 8 people. 8 carefully selected, highly motivated scientists who believed in the mission and chose to be there. Within months, they had split into 2 bitterly hostile factions. The division was so severe that the 2 groups essentially stopped speaking to each other. They could not agree on mission priorities, resource allocation, or governance. The social fabric did not just fray, it tore. And here is what haunts me about this. The hostility between those 2 factions persisted for years after the experiment ended. Years after they walked out of that building and returned to normal life, some of those relationships had not healed. 8 people, 2 years, with backup systems available, with the knowledge that it was an experiment, with the ability to see the Arizona desert through the glass walls. And they could not hold it together. Now imagine 1,000 people, 250 years, in deep space, with no backup, no way out, no Arizona desert visible through any window. Just the void. The Biosphere 2 researchers who studied the social dynamics published their findings with clear-eyed honesty. They documented how unconscious group dynamics, the kind studied in social psychology for decades, undermined and could defeat the task group's goals. Factions developed reflecting personal chemistry and disagreements on overall mission strategy. These dynamics are not bugs in human nature. They are features. They emerge reliably, predictably, inevitably when small groups of humans are confined together under stress. And they do not go away just because the mission is important. Now, I want to expand the frame dramatically because we have been talking about what happens to individuals. But a generation ship is not a collection of individuals. It is a society. And societies have their own pathologies, their own dynamics, their own ways of fracturing that go far beyond anything that happens inside a single human mind. Let us start with what I consider the most profound problem facing any generation ship, the consent crisis. The first generation of people to board a generation ship are volunteers. They made a choice. They weighed the risks, they considered the implications, and they decided that the adventure, the purpose, the chance to give humanity the stars was worth the sacrifice. They chose to leave Earth. They chose to live in a spacecraft. They chose to die in transit, knowing that their descendants would complete the journey. This choice, this informed consent, is the moral foundation of the entire enterprise, and it evaporates completely within a single generation. The children born on the ship did not choose this life. They were born into it. Their parents may have tried to imbue them with a sense of purpose, with stories about Earth and the destination, with a feeling of being part of something grand. But those children will grow up in corridors, not under open skies. Their playground is a metal floor, not a grass field. Their sky is a ceiling. And as they grow into adults and have their own children, the distance from the original choice grows wider. By generation 3, Earth is a story told by grandparents about a place they barely remember from their own childhood. By generation 5, Earth is an abstraction, a planet described in old recordings, no more emotionally real than ancient Egypt is to a teenager in modern Tokyo. A paper published in the Canadian Journal of Bioethics specifically examined this problem, the ethical considerations of generation ships, and concluded that informed consent made by the initial crew cannot meaningfully extend to their descendants. The ship-born inherit obligations without agency. They are told they must maintain the ship, they must learn specific skills, they must reproduce according to population guidelines, they must work toward a destination they will never see. All because of a decision made by dead ancestors they never met. The philosophers have a term for this, intergenerational injustice, and it is baked into the very concept of the generation ship. Think about what this means for motivation. Why should the 5th generation care about the mission? Their entire reality is the ship. Earth is a fairy tale. The destination is a promise made by ghosts. Their lived experience is maintaining recycling systems and growing hydroponic lettuce, and attending mandatory engineering classes, and being told that they cannot have a third child because the population cap would be exceeded. Where in this existence is the fire, the passion, the purpose that drove Generation 1 to leave everything behind? As one particularly incisive discussion in an online ethics forum put it, it is extremely likely that Generation ships would deviate from their original mission without extreme information control. And extreme information control has another name. It is called authoritarianism. Now let us talk about social structure, because the social engineering problem on a Generation ship might be even harder than the mechanical engineering. Consider Dunbar's number. The British anthropologist Robin Dunbar proposed, based on the correlation between brain size and social group size in primates, that the human brain can maintain approximately 150 stable social relationships. This is the number of people you can genuinely know, where you understand their personality, their history, their relationship to you, where the relationship has a real social meaning. Dunbar's number appears remarkably consistent across human societies throughout history, from hunter-gatherer bands to military companies to social media networks. On a Generation ship of 500 to 1,500 people, you do not just know 150 people. You know, or at least know of, virtually everyone, and you cannot get away from any of them. On Earth, if a relationship goes bad, you can move to a new city. If your hometown suffocates you, you can leave. If you clash with your co-workers, you can change jobs. If your neighbor is intolerable, you can move. These escape valves, these simple everyday options for managing social friction, do not exist on a Generation ship. That person who bullied you in childhood is still there. The ex-partner whose presence makes your stomach clench is still there. The authority figure you despise is still there. The clique that excluded you is still there. And they will be there tomorrow, and next year, and for the rest of your life. There is no geographic solution to interpersonal problems. Social hierarchies become rigid and essentially permanent. If a family gains power in Generation 2, they may hold it for the rest of the voyage. If certain skills are valued more highly than others, creating a social class of engineers above a social class of food producers, that hierarchy calcifies. Social mobility, which in Earth society serves as a pressure relief valve for inequality, becomes nearly impossible in a closed population where every role is essential and every position is limited. We know from Biosphere 2 that even 8 people in a closed system form factions. We know from Antarctic stations that crews of 15 to 20 develop cliques and conflicts within months. We know from submarine services worldwide that crews of 100 to 150 experience measurable psychological strain during patrols of just 60 to 90 days, despite extensive selection training and leadership. Scale this up to 1,000 people over 250 years, and faction formation is not a possibility. It is a mathematical certainty. The question is not whether factions will form, but whether those factions will tear the society apart. And then there is the most explosive social issue of all on a Generation ship: reproduction. Population control is not optional, it is as essential as oxygen recycling. The ship's life support system is designed for a specific population range. Too few people, and you do not have enough workers to maintain the ship, or enough genetic diversity to avoid inbreeding. Too many people, and you exceed the capacity of your food production, your water recycling, your atmospheric processing. The Project Hyperion competition specifies a population of 1,000 plus or minus 500, and maintaining that range over 250 years requires strict, enforced reproductive control. Think about what that means. Someone, some authority, must tell you whether you are allowed to have children, and how many. In the history of human civilization, reproductive control imposed by authority has been one of the most reliable triggers for social unrest. China's one-child policy, which lasted from 1979 to 2015, generated enormous social tension despite being implemented in a nation of over 1 billion people with vast geographic and social complexity. On a Generation ship, the reproductive policy is permanent, inescapable, and applies to everyone equally, except it will not feel equal. When the people in governance have 2 children and you are told you can only have 1, The mathematics of population management will be indistinguishable from the politics of privilege. And what happens when the population policy fails? What happens during a generation of higher-than-planned births? Do you ration food? Do you reduce the oxygen allocation? Do you sterilize people against their will? Every answer to this question is a potential trigger for revolt. Every solution creates new resentment. And the resentment does not dissipate between generations. It accumulates. Let me tell you about something researchers call cultural drift. And it is one of the most insidious threats to a generation ship. Over 250 years, roughly 10 generations, the culture of the ship will evolve. This is not a possibility. It is a certainty, as certain as biological evolution, and potentially much faster. Anthropological research on cultural evolution in isolated populations shows that small groups develop distinct cultural patterns with remarkable speed. Language evolves, values shift, beliefs change, social norms transform. Consider that in just the last 250 years on Earth, human culture has undergone transformations that would be utterly incomprehensible to someone from 1775. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the abolition of slavery, the Industrial Revolution, 2 world wars, the invention of electricity, automobiles, airplanes, nuclear weapons, computers, the internet, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, space exploration, the sexual revolution, the rise of social media. A person from 1775 transported to today would be unable to function in our society, not because they are less intelligent, but because the cultural context in which they formed their understanding of the world has been completely replaced. Now, on Earth, cultural evolution happens in interaction with a changing material world. New technologies create new possibilities, which create new social structures, which create new values. On a generation ship, the material world does not change. The ship is the ship. The technology is the technology. There are no new continents to discover, no new resources to exploit, no new inventions that fundamentally reshape daily life. Cultural evolution will still occur because it is driven by the inherently creative and adaptive nature of the human mind, but it will occur in a closed system, feeding on itself, potentially spiraling in directions that no one can predict. What happens when the ship's culture drifts away from the values that motivated the mission? What happens when Generation 7 develops a religious belief system that holds the ship itself to be sacred, the journey to be the purpose, and the destination to be a heresy? What happens when a charismatic leader in Generation 5 convinces a third of the population that the historical records about Earth are lies, that the mission is a deception, that the true purpose of the ship is something else entirely? These scenarios are not fanciful. They are extrapolations from real patterns in human cultural evolution, patterns that have played out repeatedly in isolated communities throughout history. Science fiction writers have been remarkably prescient about this. In Robert Heinlein's novel Orphans of the Sky, published in 1941, the descendants of a generation ship's crew have completely forgotten they are on a ship. They believe the ship is the entire universe. Their society has regressed to a quasi-medieval structure with a religious ruling class. The idea that there is an outside the ship is considered dangerous blasphemy. In Brian Aldiss's novel Non-Stop, the crew has regressed to a tribal society, hunting and gathering in the overgrown corridors of a ship they no longer understand. These fictions reflect a genuine sociological concern documented by researchers at institutions like the Astrosociology Research Institute, and explored in academic papers with titles like A Generation Starship Concept Between Fiction and Reality. The concern is that the specific technical knowledge required to maintain an interstellar spacecraft is so specialized, so complex, and so dependent on a particular educational infrastructure that any disruption to the chain of knowledge transmission could be catastrophic. Think about what must be reliably taught and learned every single generation: propulsion engineering, nuclear physics, atmospheric chemistry, closed-loop life support system maintenance, structural engineering, medical science including surgery, pharmacology, agricultural science, genetics and reproductive management, material science and manufacturing, electrical engineering, plumbing and fluid dynamics, psychology and conflict resolution, education itself, pedagogy, curriculum design, the science of teaching. Every single one of these disciplines must produce enough qualified specialists every generation to maintain the ship. If even one generation fails to produce enough nuclear engineers or enough atmospheric chemists or enough agricultural scientists, the consequences could be fatal for the entire population. And here is the thing about education. It requires motivation. It requires students who want to learn, or at least a society that can compel them to. It requires teachers who are competent and dedicated. It requires resources, textbooks, laboratories, simulation systems. And it requires a cultural context that values the knowledge being transmitted. If the culture drifts, if the next generation decides that engineering is boring and spiritual practice is more important, if a generation of teenagers rebels against the mandatory technical education the way teenagers on Earth rebel against homework, the chain breaks. And unlike on Earth, where lost knowledge can eventually be rediscovered through experimentation and observation of the natural world, on a generation ship, the knowledge was never discoverable from the ship's environment in the first place. You cannot rediscover nuclear physics by looking at the reactor from the outside. You cannot reinvent atmospheric chemistry by breathing the air. The knowledge exists only in the educational system, and if the educational system fails, the knowledge is gone. NASA itself experienced a version of this problem. After the Apollo program ended, the specific manufacturing knowledge needed to build Saturn V rockets was lost within just a few decades. Not because anyone decided to forget it, but because the people who held the knowledge retired or died, and no one needed to learn it, so no one did. On a generation ship, you cannot afford to lose any knowledge ever for 250 years. Let me weave in another thread here, the question of governance and rebellion. Because if the social structure is the skeleton of a generation ship society, governance is the nervous system, and both are equally vulnerable to failure. No form of government in human history has been stable for 250 years. Not democracy, not monarchy, not theocracy, not authoritarian rule, not constitutional republics. Some have lasted longer, but none without significant upheaval, revolution, civil war, or fundamental restructuring. The United States Constitution, one of the longest-lasting governing documents in the world, is only about 250 years old, and the nation it governs has experienced a devastating civil war, numerous constitutional crises, and ongoing fundamental debates about its interpretation and application. There is a remarkable academic study titled Social Order and the Genesis of Rebellion, which analysed mutiny in the Royal Navy between 1740 and 1820. The researchers found that the single largest factor explaining the incidence of mutiny was failure of governance. Not bad food, not harsh conditions, not danger, but the perception that the governing authority was unjust, incompetent, or had broken its implicit contract with those it governed. This finding has been replicated across studies of rebellion in various contexts, from prisons to military units to colonial populations. When governance fails, rebellion follows. On a generation ship, governance must be maintained flawlessly for 250 years across multiple transfers of power, through generational changes in values and expectations, through resource crises and social conflicts and psychological pressures that have no earthly precedent. And the governance must simultaneously be authoritative enough to enforce population control, resource allocation, and mandatory education, while being perceived as legitimate enough to prevent revolt. Too authoritarian, and you breed the resentment that feeds rebellion. Too democratic, and you risk a majority vote to abandon the mission, reverse course, or consume resources unsustainably. The political balance required is so precise, maintained over so long a period, that many sociologists who study the problem consider it effectively impossible without some form of technological enforcement, which raises its own disturbing questions. There is another scenario that haunts generation ship theorists, and it is the factional breakup. What happens when, 100 years into the voyage, a significant portion of the population simply decides they do not want to continue? Not a violent rebellion, but a philosophical schism. A group that says, we do not care about the destination. We do not want to colonize a planet. We want to stop here, at this asteroid, at this dwarf planet, and build a life. Or we want to decelerate and simply live on the ship indefinitely, orbiting a star, any star. Or we want to turn around. The mission was our ancestors' dream, not ours. The governance system either must prevent this democratically expressed will from being enacted, making it authoritarian, or allow it, potentially destroying the mission. If you are still here, you are one of those beautiful minds that loves going deep on a topic. Smash that subscribe button, because I can tell you, and I think the same way, and there is so much more I want to explore with you. Drop a comment telling me, do you think humans could maintain social order for 250 years in a sealed spacecraft? I have my thoughts, but I want to hear yours. Now, let us go deeper still, because we have not yet talked about what might be the most psychologically devastating aspect of the generation ship, the crisis of identity. When astronauts in orbit look out the window and see Earth, they experience something called the overview effect. It was first described by author Frank White in 1987, and has since been reported by hundreds of astronauts from dozens of nations. The experience is remarkably consistent. Seeing the Earth from space, a pale blue marble floating in the void, triggers a profound cognitive shift. A sense of the planet's fragility, of the interconnectedness of all life, of the absurdity of human borders and conflicts. Astronaut Edgar Mitchell described it as an explosion of awareness. Others have called it spiritual, transformative, life-altering. The overview effect is powerful precisely because it is grounded in a deep emotional connection to Earth. The astronauts know that planet. They grew up on it. Their families live on it. Their memories are rooted in its landscapes. Seeing it from above activates a love and a protectiveness that is already there, dormant, waiting to be awakened by this extraordinary visual stimulus. Now imagine the reverse. Imagine looking out a window on a generation ship and seeing nothing. No Earth, no blue marble, no home. Just an infinite, empty, cold blackness, studded with pinpricks of starlight that do not change perceptibly for years on end. For the later generations on a generation ship, Earth is not a home they are separated from. It is a place they have never been. By generation 5 or 6, Earth is a story, a myth, a founding legend, like the Garden of Eden or the African savanna our species originated from, intellectually acknowledged, but emotionally meaningless. The ship is home. The corridors are home. The recycled air is home. The curved ceiling is home. This creates what I would call a reverse overview effect. Instead of looking at your home from above and feeling its preciousness, you look out into the void and feel its hostility. You look away from the void and see the ship, and the ship is all there is. The psychological consequence is not awe and interconnectedness. It is claustrophobia and existential dread. Or perhaps worse, it is total indifference to the cosmos. An incuriosity born of the knowledge that the universe outside your walls is actively trying to kill you and contains nothing of relevance to your daily existence. And this leads us to one of the most painful questions in all of space exploration philosophy. What happens to human identity when you have never experienced a world? Human psychology research on place attachment shows that people derive enormous parts of their identity from their physical environment. Your hometown, your country, your landscape, the weather patterns and seasonal changes and natural features you grew up with, these shape who you are in ways so deep that you rarely even notice them. The way you think about distance, about space, about nature, about risk, all of it is calibrated by the physical world you inhabited during your formative years. On a generation ship, place is entirely artificial and entirely unchanging. There is no concept of going somewhere new because there is nowhere new to go. There is no concept of discovering something unexpected because every square meter of the ship has been known, mapped, and walked through thousands of times. There is no difference between being in your 20s and being in your 50s because the physical environment is exactly the same. On Earth, the passage of time is marked by physical changes, seasons turning, buildings rising and falling, landscapes evolving. On the ship, the passage of time is marked by nothing. The corridor looks exactly as it did on the day it was built. Think about what this does to the psychology of the middle generations. Generation 1 has purpose. They left Earth. They made the choice. They carry the fire. The last generation has purpose. They arrive. They complete the journey. They step onto a new world. But generations 3 through 8 exist solely as biological links in a chain. Their entire life's purpose, as defined by the mission, is to maintain the ship and produce the next generation. They are transmission mechanisms. Their individual lives, their personal dreams, their unique aspirations are subordinate to a mission they did not choose and will not see completed. The psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor who wrote extensively about the psychology of extreme suffering, argued that the human capacity to endure almost anything depends on having a sense of meaning. He observed that concentration camp prisoners who retained a sense of purpose, whether religious faith, love for a family member, or an intellectual project, were more likely to survive than those who lost all sense of meaning. The generation ship presents a challenge to Frankl's framework. The meaning exists, in theory. The mission is real, but the meaning belongs to the first and last generations. The middle generations must somehow construct personal meaning from a life they did not choose, in an environment they cannot change, working toward a goal they will never see fulfilled. And here is something I find haunting. Children born on a generation ship would develop fundamentally different cognitive maps than any human who has ever lived. They would have no concept of a horizon, that line where Earth meets sky, that has been a feature of every human visual environment since our species evolved. They would have no experience of weather, no understanding of the difference between a sunny day and a rainy one, except as abstract descriptions in educational materials. They would have no concept of a wild animal, of a forest, of an ocean. Their spatial cognition would be calibrated to corridors and rooms and curved surfaces, not to the open three-dimensional space of a planetary surface. Their risk assessment would be calibrated to the ship, where a punctured hull or a failed air recycling system is the primary threat, not to a planet where the threats are predators, weather, terrain, and distance. Language would drift too. Linguists document that languages in isolated communities evolve rapidly, developing new words, new grammar, new pronunciations that diverge from the parent language within just a few generations. Within 250 years, the language spoken on the ship might be substantially different from the language spoken on Earth when the ship departed. More importantly, concepts tied to Earth experience would lose their experiential referent and become abstract vocabulary. The word ocean would be like the word dragon to us, a word we know, a concept we can describe, but not something we have ever experienced. The word mountain would have no visceral meaning. The word sunrise would be a dead metaphor. And here is perhaps the most ironic twist of all. The psychological profile that would develop in ship-born humans would make them terrible planetary colonists. They would be adapted to confinement, with high tolerance for small spaces and low tolerance for open ones. They would be socially hyper-aware, having grown up in a small community where social intelligence is survival. They would be risk-averse, because in a spacecraft, risk-taking does not just endanger you, it endangers everyone. They would be deeply institutionalized, accustomed to living under rules that are not guidelines but survival requirements. These traits are perfectly adaptive for life on the ship. They are potentially catastrophic for life on a wild, unpredictable, open planetary surface. The generation ship paradox is that by the time you arrive, you may have created a population of humans who are psychologically incapable of doing the thing the ship was built to do. Now, I want to ground all of this in real-world analogues, because the generation ship is hypothetical, but the human psychological patterns we are discussing are not. They are observable, measurable, and documented in environments that share some characteristics with long-duration spaceflight. We have already talked about the Mars-500 experiment and Antarctic stations, but let me expand the frame to include some less obvious parallels. Submarine crews are one of the closest operational analogues to a generation ship. Nuclear submarine patrols last 60 to 90 days, with crews of 100 to 150 people, confined in a pressurized metal tube with no windows, no sunlight, recycled air, and limited communication with the outside world. Even these relatively short deployments produce measurable psychological effects. Anxiety increases, sleep quality decreases, interpersonal friction intensifies. Morale follows a predictable decline pattern that mirrors the third quarter phenomenon. Submarine navies invest enormously in crew selection, leadership training, recreational facilities, and critically, crew rotation. No one serves on the same submarine indefinitely. You do a patrol, you come home, you recover, you rotate to a different crew for the next deployment. This rotation is considered essential for maintaining psychological health. On a generation ship, there is no rotation. There is no coming home. The patrol never ends. Consider the mutiny on HMS Bounty in 1789, one of the most analysed events in naval history. The Bounty was on a long-duration voyage in the Pacific, months from home, under the command of Lieutenant William Bligh. The crew was confined in cramped quarters, subject to strict discipline, with limited food and no recreational variety. After months in Tahiti, where the crew experienced freedom, comfort, and social diversity, they were ordered back to sea, back to confinement. The contrast was unbearable. Fletcher Christian and 18 sailors seized the ship. The mutiny was driven not by a single catastrophic grievance, but by the accumulation of small ones, the monotony, the confinement, the loss of freedom, the perception that the authority structure was neither just nor necessary. Every one of these factors exists on a generation ship, amplified by orders of magnitude. The confinement is permanent, the monotony is lifelong. The authority structure is unchosen by those born into it, and there is no Tahiti to return to, no alternative life that was briefly tasted and lost. But the human psychological machinery that produces rebellion does not require a specific trigger. It requires only the accumulation of grievance beyond the individual's capacity to suppress it. Let me tell you about Pitcairn Island, because it is the closest thing in human history to a generation ship in miniature. After the Bounty mutineers settled on this tiny, remote island in 1790, they formed a community of approximately 27 people, 9 European men, 12 Polynesian women, and 6 Polynesian men. Within a decade, the community had nearly destroyed itself. Murders, power struggles, alcohol abuse, sexual coercion, resource conflicts. By 1800, only one of the original mutineer men was still alive. The population survived and eventually stabilized, but only after a catastrophic period of violence and social collapse. And this was on a habitable island with fresh water, arable land, and open air. Remove those ameliorating factors and replace the island with a sealed spacecraft, and the dynamics become even more volatile. The genetic considerations are equally sobering. Researcher Cameron Smith of Portland State University published a paper in Acta Astronautica calculating the minimum viable population for a multi-generational starship. His analysis, which accounted for genetic diversity, demographic risks, and potential disasters, estimated that with careful genetic management, a starting population of as few as 150 to 180 people might be biologically viable, but that a more realistic figure for social stability and redundancy would be 500 or more, with a recommendation of around 1,000. The comparison to genetic bottlenecks in human history is telling. The Toba catastrophe hypothesis suggests that approximately 70,000 years ago, a supervolcanic eruption reduced the human population to perhaps 1,000 to 10,000 breeding pairs. Our species survived, obviously, but the genetic consequences are still detectable in our DNA today, in reduced genetic diversity compared to other primate species. On a generation ship, the population starts small and stays small. Without careful genetic management, through frozen sperm and embryo banks, and assisted reproduction technology, genetic diversity would erode through random drift and inbreeding within just a few generations, leading to what geneticists call inbreeding depression, reduced fertility, increased susceptibility to disease, and the accumulation of harmful recessive traits. The ship essentially becomes an island, and islands are notorious in evolutionary biology for their strange effects on isolated populations. Island dwarfism, island gigantism, rapid speciation, loss of fear of predators, loss of flight in birds. These are the effects of small, isolated populations evolving under different selective pressures than their mainland ancestors. Over 10 generations on a generation ship, analogous processes would begin, not necessarily in the dramatic forms seen on islands over millions of years, but in subtle, compounding ways that could make the shipborne increasingly different from their earthbound counterparts. Now, let us talk about something that gives me a glimmer of hope in all this darkness: solutions. Or at least, attempted solutions. Because the problems I have described are terrifying, but humans have a remarkable track record of solving terrifying problems, and the people working on generation ship design are neither naive nor ignorant of the psychological and social challenges. The most straightforward solution to the psychological pressure of confinement is size. The bigger the habitat, the less it feels like a ship. Gerard O'Neill's original Island 1 concept envisioned a habitat for 10,000 people, large enough to contain artificial landscapes, hills, rivers, even weather. If you scale up to the full O'Neill cylinder concept, several kilometers long and a couple of kilometers in diameter, the interior could contain forests, lakes, and architectural diversity that would significantly mitigate the sensory monotony problem. You could have neighborhoods with different characters, parks where you can walk without seeing a wall, and enough physical space that you are not always within arm's reach of your neighbors. But size comes with a devastating cost. Larger ships require exponentially more mass, more fuel, more complex engineering, and more powerful propulsion. There is an agonizing trade-off between psychological livability and physical buildability. The Project Hyperion competition's constraint of 500 to 1,500 people reflects this tension. It is large enough for genetic viability and basic social complexity, but small enough to be conceivably built and propelled. Whether it is large enough for psychological survival over 250 years is an open and deeply uncertain question. Environmental variability within the ship is another proposed solution. Instead of a uniform habitat, design the ship with multiple distinct zones, different neighborhoods with different architectural styles, different lighting color temperatures, different vegetation, even different ambient sounds. Simulate seasons by gradually changing the lighting spectrum and temperature throughout the year. Introduce controlled weather, rain systems, wind generators, fog machines. It sounds strange, but the psychological value of environmental variety is so well documented that it is worth engineering significant complexity into the ship's habitat just to provide it. There is a fascinating study from 2025 that tested virtual reality-based nature therapy on people experiencing mild depression during a simulated space station isolation experiment. The results showed meaningful improvements in mood and well-being. This suggests that VR technology could be part of the solution, providing simulated experiences of Earth environments, forests, beaches, mountains that would be otherwise impossible in a spacecraft. Imagine growing up on a generation ship, but spending part of every day in a VR simulation of Earth, experiencing rain, birdsong, sunlight, open horizons. It would not be the same as the real thing, but it might be enough to prevent the worst effects of sensory deprivation. Governance design is perhaps the most critical and least understood solution. No off-the-shelf political system can be assumed to work for 250 years in a closed environment. Some researchers have proposed hybrid systems, a constitutional framework established by the first generation that is extremely difficult to amend, combined with rotational democratic elements for day-to-day governance, supported by AI systems that monitor resource distribution and flag emerging inequities before they become crises. Others have proposed more radical approaches, decentralized governance structures modeled on cooperative movements, or even algorithmic governance where key resource allocation decisions are made by transparent computer systems rather than human politicians, removing the personal element that breeds resentment. The education system, as I discussed earlier, is arguably the most critical institution on the ship, more important than engineering, more important than medicine, because without reliable knowledge transmission, everything else fails. Some proposals include redundant knowledge preservation, not just in digital form, which is vulnerable to data degradation and technological obsolescence, but in physical form, books, engraved plates, mechanical models. The idea is that even if the digital systems fail, even if the educational culture degrades, the core technical knowledge survives in a form that can be rediscovered and reconstructed. There is a fascinating approach to the motivation problem that draws on anthropological insights. Throughout human history, the institutions that have survived for centuries or millennia, such as certain religious organizations, certain universities, certain legal traditions, have all shared common features. They embed their core purpose in ritual, in narrative, in identity, in community practice. They do not rely on rational argument alone to motivate participation. They create a sense of belonging, a sense of meaning, a sense of being part of something larger than yourself. Some generation ship theorists propose deliberately designing the ship's culture along these lines, creating rituals around the mission, celebrations of the journey's milestones, a rich narrative tradition about Earth and the destination that gives every generation an emotional connection to the mission, not just an intellectual one. Now, let me introduce a concept that many people find disturbing, but that we must honestly discuss: The idea of biological solutions. If the human mind and body are not suited to a generation ship, some researchers have asked whether we should modify the mind and body rather than the ship. Genetic engineering could theoretically produce humans more suited to the generation ship environment. People with enhanced radiation resistance, reduced susceptibility to the psychological effects of confinement, altered sleep requirements, or modified social behavior. This raises profound ethical questions. Would genetically modified ship dwellers still be human in the way we understand the term? Who decides what modifications are acceptable? And critically, the people being modified are the ship-born, who once again did not consent. A less radical but still significant biological approach involves maintaining genetic diversity through frozen genetic material. Even with a crew of only 1,000, a ship could carry frozen sperm and embryo samples from millions of donors, stored at the cryogenic temperatures readily available in deep space. Reproduction could be managed through assisted reproductive technology, with each child's genetic parentage carefully selected to maximize diversity and minimize inbreeding. This is technically feasible with current or near-current technology, and it addresses the genetic bottleneck problem effectively, though it does introduce its own social complications. How do you explain to a child that their biological father is a sample frozen on Earth 200 years ago? How does that affect identity and family structure? There are also the alternative approaches that sidestep the generation ship concept entirely. Cryogenic sleep, or suspended animation, would eliminate the generational problem by putting the crew to sleep for the journey. They would wake up at the destination as the same people who left Earth, with their memories, their skills, their motivation, and their sanity intact. The problem is that current cryonics technology is nowhere near capable of this. Freezing a human body causes ice crystal formation that destroys cellular structure. While there has been progress in vitrification, a process that turns tissue into a glass-like state without ice crystal formation, and in therapeutic hypothermia, which can slow biological processes significantly, the ability to freeze and revive a complete human being remains firmly in the realm of science fiction for now. Another alternative is the embryo ship or seed ship, which sends frozen genetic material rather than living people, along with artificial wombs and AI systems, designed to gestate and raise the first generation at the destination. This eliminates the social collapse problem entirely, but creates, arguably, an even more challenging one. Can artificial intelligence raise psychologically healthy human beings? Everything we know about child development says that human children need human caregivers, warm, responsive, emotionally attuned adults who provide not just physical care but the social modeling and emotional nourishment that builds a healthy mind. We have zero evidence that AI can provide this, and considerable evidence from studies of institutional child rearing on Earth that suggests the absence of genuine human attachment figures leads to devastating psychological consequences. And then there is what I call the cruelest scenario in all of space exploration, the technological leapfrog. Imagine this. Humanity launches a generation ship in the year 2200. It travels at 2% of light speed toward Proxima Centauri, a 200-plus year journey. The first generation settles in. The second generation is born. Life on the ship takes on its own rhythm. Then, in 2350, 150 years into the voyage, humanity on Earth develops a significantly faster propulsion technology. A new ship is launched at 10% of light speed. It will arrive at Proxima Centauri in approximately 43 years, reaching the destination before the generation ship, which still has over 100 years of travel ahead of it. The generation ship receives this news via radio, delayed by years of light travel time but eventually unmistakable. A faster ship has been launched. It will arrive first. The destination will be colonized by people who left Earth after you, using technology that did not exist when you left. Your entire journey, your parents' entire lives, your grandparents' entire lives, the suffering and sacrifice of multiple generations was unnecessary. You could have waited. Your ancestors could have waited, but they did not. And now you are here, in the middle of the void, redundant. This is not science fiction. It is game theory. In 2006, a researcher named Andrew Kennedy formalized what he called the weight calculation, an analysis of the optimal time to launch an interstellar mission based on expected technological improvement rates. His conclusion was sobering. For almost any reasonable assumption about the rate of technological progress, it is better to wait. The ship you could build tomorrow will always be faster than the ship you can build today, and the delay in launching is more than compensated by the shorter travel time. The optimal launch window, according to Kennedy's analysis, may be decades or centuries in the future. For the crew of a generation ship that has been overtaken, the psychological devastation would be total. Every sacrifice rationalized by the mission's importance is revealed to have been pointless. Every freedom surrendered, every child born into confinement, every life lived and ended inside the ship, all of it was for nothing. The mission that gave meaning to their ancestors' lives, and by inheritance to their own, is exposed as a premature decision that caused needless suffering. How does a society recover from that revelation? How does a generation ship's population maintain any sense of purpose after learning they are a monument to impatience? Let me tell you about one more thing that most discussions of generation ships overlook entirely, and it is perhaps the most viscerally terrifying of all: the arrival. Let us assume, against all the odds I have described, that a generation ship successfully completes its 250-year voyage. The population has survived. The social order has held. The life support systems have functioned.